And thanks, Natascha and Lartease for joining. And maybe before we go into the quick round of intros, I had a funny encounter on my way here this morning, and I thought I share this kind of as an introduction on what we are going to discuss today. I took the train from Cologne, where I live, to come out here, and I was sitting next to this guy, always also on a work trip, both of us on our laptops, and we started chatting a bit and talking about work and where we are heading, etc. And he said something, he goes to the Wealth Management Summit, so I thought it sounds boring but also interesting, with a lot of money involved probably. And then he asked me, yeah, what about you? And I said, yeah, I'm also going to a summit. I'm going to the Ad Filtering Dev Summit. I'm hosting a panel. It's about new laws and regulations and online advertisement, you know, with all the data collection, really interesting, what the lawmakers are thinking, etc., etc. So I get really hyped up and excited. And the guy was not having it. He just looked at me straight and he said, okay. And then he went back to his laptop again. So
I hope that happened here, right? I see some empty chairs, I'm not sure.
I hope we do a way better job in getting you excited and educated on today's session than my train ride here. But with having said this, maybe we can do a quick intro. You heard my name. I work for eyeo. I'm in Ben's team. We also deal with government relations, so we keep on track on a few of the issues we're going to talk about today. And with me I'm having Natascha.
Hi, so as the introduction said, I'm the Director for Privacy and Data Policy at CIPL. I have been there for about a year and a half now, and before that I worked for almost 14 years for an American law firm as external counsel on privacy matters as well. And so CIPL itself works as we are a think tank, a global think tank, and clearly we think a lot, and we try to be thought leaders on issues related to privacy and to push for accountable use of personal data as it feeds our digital ecosystem, really. So very topical for all y'all.
Awesome. Thank you. Lartease, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Lartease Tiffith. I'm the Executive Vice President for Public Policy at the Interactive Advertising Bureau. The IAB, we represent over 700 of the leading companies that are in the digital advertising and media industry. So we work with everyone from like the brands to the ad agencies to the ad tech, so a full stack of ad tech. As well as we work with the platforms, and we work with any and everyone who's sort of makes up the ecosystem of advertising. And I am the executive vice president, so I lead the public policy function, which is basically to represent the entirety of the industry before policymakers and regulators. So, yeah, glad to be here. Sorry, I had to do this remotely, but I'm excited to talk to you all today.
Awesome. Thanks, Lartease. And now you can attest that we have the right experts here, also with a very strategic geographic location, with Natascha covering a lot of EU policies, working for a global organization, and Lartease being located in Washington, D.C., also for a global organization covering on the US side of things. And maybe as a quick additional thought on why we believe this is a very relevant discussion to be had, especially right now, is that we see in online advertisement so many new regulatory initiatives, so many new laws and proposals being put forward. And it used to be all about privacy, but now we see a lot of issues also happening on the fringes or outskirts of privacy. So you also have competition concerns, you have AI in the mix, you have privacy-related implementation when it comes to the implementation of GDPR or the e-privacy directive, what we heard about when Peter presented earlier. So we have a lot to cover, and I believe the timing could also not be better, because we have both in the EU and the US the end of the legislative mandates. So we will have a new European Parliament and thereby new European Commission voted next year in June, and then also next year in November we have the presidential elections in the US, which will bring a new White House but also a new Congress. So we can now discuss what happened in the current ending legislative term, but also we can try to look in the future what's ahead of us. And having said this, maybe Natascha, to start with you, being so into the weeds when it comes to regulatory issues for online advertisement in Brussels, could you walk us through what you believe are the most relevant changes we saw in the last couple of years when it comes to the policies concerning online advertisement?
Sure. I think from the legislative side, I would say the DSA, the Incoming Digital Service Act, is probably the most relevant for this audience. It will become applicable across all EU member states. The regulation, meaning the instrument is directly applicable in all EU member states, and it's going to start to be in effect as of February of next year. It means that all digital players in the EU single market, and not just those headquarters there, but those offering services in the EU, will have to abide by its rule. The DSA takes a tiered approach to digital advertising. For online platforms, there are specific transparency rules, along with certain restrictions on the types of advertising that can be done, in particular when it comes to targeted advertising, and to ensure that those who are being targeted or who receive ads know that they are receiving an ad and why they are receiving that specific ad. And then there is an additional tier for very large platforms, those that reach more than 45 million plus users in Europe. There are further enhanced obligations and risk mitigation obligations. I think what is very important to know about the DSA and to take away today is that it makes clear that the profiling for serving ads based on what we consider special categories, or it used to be called sensitive data. So that's data that's based on somebody's religion or their sexual preferences, or whether or not somebody is a member of a union, which could be interesting in the upcoming elections, for instance, as a topic. Those kinds of information, health data, etc., is called, that's considered a special category or sensitive data. And ads based on that, where you're profiled based on what seems to be your preference online, are prohibited without at least your consent, and also that behavioral advertisement to minors is prohibited strictly going forward. The Commission will have oversight powers over what I called earlier the very large platforms. And then member states, so each individual national member state will have to empower a national authority for oversight. I think it's important to remember that the GDPR already does provide for a right to object to direct marketing, so that is a rule that's been in effect for a while. But that the DSA, as I was saying, adds additional obligations onto those who are targeting for ad. And the idea of the DSA overall is to create this, what the Commission considers to be sort of the safe and predictable and trustworthy online environment. This idea of trust plays a huge role in the Commission's strategy around our digital economy and our digital reality. I think what I would find actually more interesting, or not more interesting, but very concerning to me at least, are very recent developments, and they're not on the legislative side, but more on the side of decisions from data protection authorities, and from the court, and what that means for advertising. So in December of last year, there was a binding decision from the European Data Protection Board, which is sort of an overarching body of all national European data protection authorities, regarding Meta's Facebook and Instagram services. That as a result, and you may have seen that in the media, ended with a fine handed down to Meta of 210 million euros. You know, we've topped that in the meantime, but that was for something else. But you know, that was eye-watering already. I'm not going to go into the detail of, you know, why the European Data Protection Board was involved. It has to do with how the GDPR sets up cooperation and oversight between the data protection agencies. Generally, for Meta in Europe, Ireland is the responsible data protection authority, and they have first say. And this was about a case regarding Meta changing the way they have users sign into their services and agree to them being targeted by ads, namely by incorporating this into their terms and services and relying on a legal basis for the processing of personal data for those purposes. As it's called contractual necessity. I'm not going to bore you with all the legal details, but there was a complaint issued, and there was a question on whether this is possible, because there in the law it says, you know, it has to be necessary for the contract. So is content targeting and the targeting for ads, is that necessary if you are providing a contract, if you're providing these services for Instagram and Facebook? And the Irish Data Protection Authority thought that it could be possible, and they actually assumed that the user understands when entering into these contracts with Meta that this is what this service, this particular service does. It targets and it tailors content to me, which includes ad, and I can either agree to that. I can either enter into a contract with them or not. A number of the other data protection authorities, however, disagreed, and then it went to this very complicated one-stop shop process, which ended up with the European Data Protection Board as the last instance there, saying we disagree. There is not a close enough relationship between you wanting to have these services and the fact that Meta is advertising to you based on your behavior on the platform. And so this is not a sufficient legal basis, and hence the fine. So you were in violation of data protection law, and hence the fine. Which means that there is a question, and there has been a discussion for a while now, and there's this question on what is the appropriate legal basis under the GDPR when you have to process personal data for this kind of behavioral advertising, personalized advertising, for instance. And there's another decision, and maybe you've read about this in the news, that is more recent, that was in July of this year. It's another Meta case, so Meta is fighting all those fights at the moment, but it's called the Bundeskartellamt case, and the Bundeskartellamt is the German competition authority, and they had a case against Meta on whether or not they were abusing what the Bundeskartellamt considers the dominant position in the market by forcing users to have to agree to being targeted, advertised to. And this went through the system and was eventually referred to the Court of Justice of the European Union. And for our purposes here, the important part of that decision is that the court further tightened this discussion that I mentioned before on what are the legal bases available to those online platforms, in this case again Meta, when it comes to the processing of personal data for personalized content. And the court found that the processing of this data must be, again, essential for the functioning of this contract, and says that that is not the case, so also dismissed this contractual legal basis, meaning that platforms cannot rely on a contract being entered into between the parties to do this. And then it looked at other legal bases, such as, there's another one called legitimate interest, and in fact found that other than what I mentioned earlier, what the Irish Data Protection Authority found, that the average user cannot expect the content to be targeted to them. And so their interest of not being targeted by adverts will always outweigh the interest of Meta or whichever platform to target adverts. And so this is another legal basis that is no longer available. And in the end, the court has limited the legal basis effectively to consent and said either consent or perhaps for a small fee or for a fee, this could potentially be a possibility. And you will probably, or some of you will have seen this in the news, that seems to be a direction we're seeing this headed. What followed this discussion and what is interesting is that Norway, the Data Protection Authority in Norway, issued a temporary ban in Norway for behavioral advertising following this Bundeskartellamt decision, saying that that the Irish Data Protection Authority already found that contract is not an appropriate legal basis, legitimate interest also not available, and until Meta changes to consent for behavioral advertising, their services, these kinds of services, are banned, and the ban lasted actually until today, technically. But in the meantime, Norway has appealed to the European Data Protection Board, again, complicated procedure for an urgent binding decision to say that this particular ban needs to be applicable throughout Europe. And there's only been one of these procedures, it's under Article 66 of the GDPR, there's only been one other procedure like that, and so this is basically where a Data Protection Authority says that rights will be violated if we don't have this urgent decision now, and in the previous case it was dismissed, and there's a good chance that this will happen here as well, because the Irish Data Protection Authority is already looking into Meta's legal basis. I'm going to stop there before I bore everybody to death. But so I think what you can take away from this is that there is a very strong ongoing discussion on what the appropriate legal basis is for this, and then there is a very strong push, not just by the court, but also by data protection authorities, and we see it also by legislators and other legal acts that we have seen handed down in Europe, such as the Digital Markets Act as well, that there is this continued and increasing preference for consent as the silver bullet, as the one and only for all of these. And I think we'll get into a discussion as to why that maybe is not such a good idea.
Yeah, that's first of all, I believe they put the date for the ban for today because they knew of our panel.
Of course.
It's a good coincidence. And I think it's very interesting to look at all those emerging new laws and obligations, while at the same time having a lot of additional legal uncertainty coming with the implementation of the laws and rules that we have already in place in Europe, which segues me over to Lartease, looking across the pond. I'm lucky enough to receive your updates from your work, and you seem similarly busy with covering all the policies and new proposals being put forward in the US, so maybe you could walk us through the most recent development when it comes to regulation over there and digital advertisement.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I will say is that in the US, what we're finding is that a lot more things are happening in the state level than at the federal level. So, I think the states have been very active this year. I think it started with everyone sort of looking at what California was doing. And then it's kind of spawned from that, where right now we have, just this year, 5 laws that are in effect. So we have, California, we have Utah, we have Virginia, we have Connecticut, and so there's been like this, but since then there's been like this proliferation of other states that have passed laws. So now we're up to 13. And if it's okay with folks, at some point I'll share my slide, but I have like a kind of a chart that I borrowed from another a friend that sort of lays out on a geographic level what has been going on in the US in terms of like data privacy laws. But before I go there, I also want to just talk about what's also happening at the federal level, which is basically we are seeing for the last few years, there's been an effort afoot to see some kind of federal law passed to sort of deal with what we consider to be a patchwork of state laws. But I'm sure for those who are focusing or following what's happening in the U.S., getting things done in Congress is not easy. As we saw yesterday, we lost our Speaker of the House. First time in history where they were removed. It was the second time that actually there was an attempt, but the first time that someone actually been removed in history as Speaker of the House. And so things are not going so well on the congressional level. Knowing that things don't move very well or very often in Congress, we're seeing that our federal agency, primarily the Federal Trade Commission, is sort of doing a lot of things as well. So the FTC over the last couple years has started looking at how data is used, and in fact, digital advertising is a big focus of theirs. So it started with what they have coined as commercial surveillance and reviewing, what is basically targeted advertising and seeing and presuming that it's actually unfair or deceptive. So there's been a lot of effort by them to do something. I will say that the good news is that they have very limited power to do anything. Congress is responsible for delegating what authorities the FTC has, and if the FTC had the authorities they thought they had, then they would not need to. The Congress would not need to act. So, anyway, let me show you with you, if I can, a chart that kind of outlines what's been going on in the states. Bear with me for one moment while I do that. Are you all able to see the chart?
Nope.
Nope. Just 1 second, I believe. Now, now we see it.
Or no?
We saw it for a second, and you again.
Okay.
Now we see it. Yeah.
Beautiful.
All right, great. Okay. So the chart kind of outlines what's been happening. Like as I mentioned earlier, there are already 5 states that have existing laws. So that's California, Virginia, Colorado, Connecticut, and Utah. But since then, what we've had another 8, almost 8, who have passed laws that are going to go into effect over the next couple years. So we have Indiana, we have Iowa, we have Florida, we have Montana, Oregon, Tennessee, Texas, and in Washington. Now, Washington's law is actually, it's titled a healthcare law, but when you look at the definition, it actually is a consumer law. It's so broad, it basically is a consumer data protection law. In addition to those, we've also had states introduce kid-specific laws, so very robust ones. So California has a age-appropriate design code, which is modeled after the UK's age-appropriate design code. And then Utah has this social media law that's different, that deals with like whether social media can be accessible to kids and what type of protections or parental controls must be in place, and what companies must do in order to sort of know what the age of their users are and so forth. So it's a really, those laws are really robust, and they all impact what's happening here. Well, specifically the Utah law has a ban on ads to kids, which is a first among what we'll likely see other states sort of adopting that same law. It is being challenged, I will say, as well as some of the other laws are being challenged, the California one as well. And we'll see kind of how that all unfolds in the U.S. But what you can see from this chart is, I mentioned the ones that have actually either have existing laws or ones that have recently passed, but that's not the end of it. There are a dozen other states that are looking to pass laws, and we have our eyes on 5 that are likely joining this sort of group of states. We're looking at New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. They're potentially up next to pass data privacy laws. And what the concern is that if you look at these laws, they're very different. There are some basic things like consumer rights, whether it's access, deletion, that sort of stuff. But then there are the definitions and how they operate are so vastly different. And so what is happening is it's starting to create sort of this compliance burden for businesses, especially businesses in our industry in digital advertising, figuring out how you're going to comply with this sort of patchwork. On the other side is that for consumers, it's leading to what's going to likely be very, very different experiences when they move from one state or, go from California to Utah or Virginia. They're going to see sort of have a different user experience. I'm sure many people are already familiar. If you travel from the U.S. to Europe, you tend to see the differences in the user experience. I know I do when I travel to Europe. All of a sudden I see a lot of pop-ups. I see a lot of things saying, do you want to accept this? Do you want to not accept this? What's essential? What's not essential? That kind of thing. And what that does is that, like for me, it leads to a lot of friction for consumers. And I think instead of seeing that when I go from the U.S. to the EU, what I'm going to start seeing is when I go from California to any other state, I'm going to have a very, very different user experience. So this is becoming a real problem for us. And what we've been focusing on collectively, I think in the U.S., is sort of figuring out how do we get a federal privacy law done. I'm going to stop sharing just so I can go back so people can see me. But we will kind of figure out how can we deal with this, because this is not unattainable. I think at least in Europe you have GDPR, right? I mean, it is the law that covers Europe. You have less, at least everyone kind of knows what the law is that we're going to mostly rely on in terms of consumer protection in the EU. In the US, we don't have that. I do think that is a real concern for us, because the state patchwork is not really going to work for us. I can happily go into some of the other things that are sort of happening in the U.S. As well, in addition to the sort of the privacy things and the kids bills that I've talked about that are happening. There's an effort afoot to pass a federal privacy laws, and the main one that everyone's sort of looking at is the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, ADPPA as we call it. That was introduced last year. It had a markup in the House Energy and Commerce Committee. It moved out of that committee, but it never moved beyond that. And part of the problem is, as you can imagine, is the representatives who are from California, they had a big opposition to the idea that the ADPPA would override what we call preemption, would preempt their law and therefore remove it. And so they were against ADPPA. In addition to that, you had other members who had concerns around the impact of the law on small businesses and et cetera. So it never moved anywhere. We actually had concerns around it from the digital advertising industry. We had basically 5 concerns. One is that it didn't fully preempt all laws. It actually carved out some state laws and therefore wasn't a one single federal law that we wanted. The other concerns were around the ability for individuals to sue. In the U.S., I don't know, I'm very familiar with the U.S., but we tend to be very litigious. And so the idea that we would give individuals the right to sue directly for any potential perceived violation would lead to an avalanche of lawsuits and legal costs for companies. Three other things.
We had, sorry, Lartease, to interrupt. We had Natascha also. We giggled a little bit when you made the GDPR comment. So I just want to make sure we have a chance to Natascha to lean in and comment real quick, and B, also being mindful of time, that we also want to have a short Q&A at the end with the audience. And I have also another quick question for you. We hand over to Natascha.
No, we were giggling because you were saying sort of, we have the GDPR, and at least we all know what the law is. We do have, though, 27 member state data protection agencies who are all independent, and they all have slightly different ideas of how to interpret it. So it's maybe not quite as green the grass on this side, but certainly there's an advantage, and CIPL closely follows the US because we're global and we have an office in DC as well, and we're very, very supportive of a federal data privacy law, not in the least bit because this is one of the perceived obstacles for the survival of the data privacy framework that we now have here. Is those opposing it are saying that the level of protection you have in the US is patchwork, as you were describing, and so the fact that there isn't a federal privacy law that at least creates a baseline for privacy is an issue that plays a role here. So that is a big question. And but personally, I understand California because their law, of course, sets a high ceiling for U.S. standards at least, and the federal privacy law because it's a committee-based law. It may not go quite as high, but in my view, it's still better to have a baseline federal law that applies everywhere, because we also see that from our member companies. And we had a webinar, in fact, and we have a map that looks very similar to yours, where really it is an issue for companies to know what law is applicable, and also for individuals to whom to turn. Reminds me a little bit of COVID times, where in the tri-state area, so where you live, you had 3 different COVID apps, and they were not interchangeable. What was the point of that? And it's within a radius of 50 miles. So. Anyway, I think you had a question for us at the end, what our main wish is, and I'll tell you then. But
exactly, this is kind of as segueing over to the Q&A with the audience. I was wondering, we have now all the issues and topics we discussed so far, and we also have elections happening next year. So if we would meet a year from now, or 14, 15 months from now, we would have a new political leadership both in the US and on the European level. And I'm just curious, play a little bit crystal ball here, if you could, give one initiative or one topic to the new lawmakers, or if you would say, I'm pretty sure they're gonna cover X, Y, Z. Just curious to kind of get your outlook and perspective on things.
Should I? So for me, it's convergence on any of these issues, because we have this patchwork of rules, and we really, we also are looking at that in AI. We are all trying to get our arms around on how do we deal with AI, how do we regulate something, how do we oversee something, how do we create ethical AI rules for something that by its very nature is continuously developing. And is the EU AI Act the right tool? I don't know. We'll have to see, and it's the first law of its kind, and we'll see how it shakes out. We are going to have a paper out where, as I said at the beginning, we think a lot. So 10 recommendations of what we think AI regulation should look like globally. But this is one topic where I think, because AI doesn't stop at borders, for instance, convergence and a common approach, at least between partner nations, but also bringing the non-partner nations in, because again, AI doesn't stop at borders and has enormous benefits. We can all see that. There's a cost of not using AI that we would all as a society pay. But then, talking of elections, generative AI and elections scare the socks off of me, right? Because it sounds like us. And it's very seductive, I would say, and it is really a tool that can be very effectively used in the context of mis and disinformation. So there is a clear need to think about together how we get our arms around that. But this also goes in this, what I talked about before. This move towards saying consent is the answer to everything, which is more of an older idea of putting the individual in the center. That's great, but now we're putting all the burden on the individual, and it's just not feasible. And so we need to think more toward how do we use technology to solve some of these issues. I think there was a lecture earlier on privacy-enhancing technologies. Great, you know, let's do more of that. Let's use AI also to fight certain, like for instance, to detect CSAM, child sexual explorative material online, these kinds of things. That for me is really the thinking. How can we reconstruct existing laws to apply to what is the now, rather than looking at concepts backwards? When the GDPR was conceived, you know, it came out, the first draft from the Commission came out in 2012. None of us were thinking about generative AI at that point. How do you fit these concepts that are in our data protection law to the new technology?
I just try to remember what I was thinking about in 2012, but maybe we don't go there. Lartease, same crystal ball wish list for the new administration. Question to you.
Now, a year from now, we'll still be in the middle of our campaign that's going on. I think I foresee a rematch between Trump and Biden. So from October of next year, we'll be doing with that. But post that, say another 6 months, the new administration goes in. My wish list is also just like Natascha's. I think AI is essentially like the #1 issue we're all trying to address right now. It's not that AI is new. Like AI has been around. I think there's, it's been around for a long time. Machine learning, it's been around forever. I think the classic AI, as we sort of think about, is machine just kind of, doing things that humans do, but doing it faster. It's this generative AI that's really much different. I think this is the next inflection point in AI, and it's much different from what we used to in AI. So it's freaking everybody out because they don't know what to do from the digital advertising perspective. We have publishers who are concerned about what does this mean if the user interface changes. Right now, all the publishers rely on people coming to their websites or coming to them, and all of a sudden, if people don't need to, because the generative AI will just sprout out an answer to them. But the other concern is the generation of that answer is usually relying on some of their own scraping of potential public information, including off of websites. And so there's concerns around what do we do about it? So I think a challenge in the US, and I would love to see the new administration come 2025, if we don't address it before then, which we're unlikely to do given the functionality in Congress. But ultimately, I'd love to see us figure that out. I think that's the #1 issue we have to address for many, many reasons. That is the #1 issue.
Perfect. We got a good wish list. I hope the right people are listening. And now we bring out the point guard from Kentucky with the question microphone.
Roll Tide, right? Or what is it?
We don't like Alabama, Kentucky, because I kill.
It's ice hockey, right?
Go Cats. BBN.
It's ice hockey, right?
No, it doesn't get that cold in Kentucky. Questions, though, we have plenty of them, I'm sure. Who'd like to go first? Anybody?
We killed the room.
Oh, we got one over there. All right, you're closer.
So from a US perspective, for privacy, is it better would it be better for a Democrat or a Republican for data privacy if they were in power?
Wow, that's an interesting question, and I see my friend Lee is sitting there next to you. Yeah, I mean, so my view actually is I'm biased, so everyone should know I represent industry, so I am biased. So I'll just say that, I'll give that caveat. I think from a privacy standpoint, it would actually be better with Republicans, I'll be honest, because I think we need to make sure that whatever privacy we put forth will protect consumers, but it also needs to work for businesses, right? We can't have a situation where we cut off all access to data because we are afraid of what maybe 3 or 4 companies are doing, but the entirety of our economy is driven by data. And so to decide we're going to cut off all of data is not a very great approach. I think it's basically throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So I think in my estimate, it would be better to have something that's a little bit more business friendly, but still protecting consumers. And so I think Republicans would probably be better for that.
So I would like to. So I don't think it should be about whether it's Democrats or Republicans. I shouldn't, hence my point on convergence earlier. I think the unfortunate truth is that if you have a two-party system like the US, then it does get squeezed into this, and you have this very broad range of political issues that you're trying to squeeze into two parties. Whereas in Europe, this would be maybe 4 or 5 parties, and you'd have to find coalitions, and you'd have to work together. And so the problem to me is a bit this bipartisan nature, and I don't think it's a Republican or a Democratic issue. It should be something that concerns all of us, really. And I don't know what, I mean, personally, you know better, of course, in the US. For full disclosure, I'm also American, so I also vote in the US. I vote a lot next year because I have a couple of nationalities. But I think if we stopped asking the question like that, and if we can start to have a dialogue, we get a lot further than trying to say it's the Republicans or it's the Democrats. In the US, that's my personal view. Because it's clickbait, right? If you do it, if you pit it like this, then it perpetuates this. That's my view, and that's how I see it playing out in the US at the moment.
Yeah, we Americans, we've been waiting on that third party, and that fourth party, and that fifth party, and they're coming. Oh, no, they're not. All the Americans in the crowd are like, no. One more. Got one?
Hi, thanks. This is a really interesting discussion. First of all, have you got any ammo for my fight with Vergar later?
No, but I'll do the fight for you. I box every Saturday morning.
Okay. That's not the answer I was expecting, but why not? No, I was curious. So I'm from the UK. Does the UK have any kind of impact on, now it's no longer part of the EU, they're going to look for their own kind of regulations that are coming up, but also the rest of the world. Like Australia's got its own privacy laws coming in, and I'm not so familiar with other parts of the world, to be honest, with their regulations, but I'm sure there's stuff being developed, being worked on.
So the UK, I work a lot with the UK, and they have some interesting ideas on how they adapt the UK version of the GDPR, which of course started out the same. And I talked about legitimate interest, for instance, earlier. And so they're trying to open it up more, and they're thinking more about how to make it more applicable and how to open it up for specific purposes, and how, for instance, medical research and these kinds of things. So I think they have some really good ideas, and to your point, they're quite practical in their approach. The ICO, which is the UK Data Protection Authority, has always been the agency I would go to for guidance. And so this shows to me that it's maybe not partisan, it's more like, how are you thinking about these issues? And are you trying to create practical guidance for not just the citizens? So you're not just looking at it from one point of view, but also the industry that's there. Because in the end, we are all participants in the digital society, and I think it's an illusion to say I can remove myself fully from it at this point. And when we create laws and when we interpret laws, it's not for us, right? It's for the next generation. So we have to think forward when we do this, and we can't have reference points when we interpret the law that go to 2012 when the GDPR first came out, for instance. And the UK, in my view, is trying to do that to a degree. I mean, there are some questions around this, and the online safety bill certainly has some questions around it, but they have some really interesting ideas, and the ICO certainly, when you talk to them, have some interesting, and they are very much thinking also about some of what I mentioned earlier in terms of, how do we interpret the concepts of the GDPR for AI, for instance, controller processor in the AI value chain, difficult to do. How do I exercise my right to be forgotten in a machine learning environment? It's like trying to pull the mortar out of your building. So.
Thanks.
Maybe we could do one quickie if anyone has one. Maciek, I saw you over there.
There was, yeah. Somebody very
Here,
patient.
all right. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So my question is, I'm trying to figure out whether big tech would be opposed or pro with regards to like federal or like trans-European regulations. Because on one hand, it's hard and expensive to provide different solutions for consent and privacy for like every member state, and every state like you have several dozen different implementations. On the other hand, if it is fragmented, then it's probably easier to like combat it. So which outweighs which?
I don't know, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so I will also, for full disclosure, say that I used to work at Amazon. So I'm also just full disclosure. So I have you take what I say with that information, share it with you. So from bigger companies, big tech companies, I think fundamentally they actually prefer one global law, right? That was sensible. Right, so we're at this point. The fragmentation is a concern for companies because they have to stand up whole new compliance programs for every geographic area. What's happening in Europe, soon the UK, the US, with all the states, Latin America. So we haven't even talked about Brazil. What's going on down there? There is this sort of fragmentation across the globe. APAC is another area, things like that. So it would be great if we had harmonization across the laws globally, because that would mean that it would be much easier to comply with for them. Unfortunately, we don't live in that world. Every locality wants to put their own stamp and mark on a privacy law. They don't want to just simply adopt what another country did. And so that is part of the problem. But from a business perspective, it would be better if we had harmonization across the globe.
I also work with a lot of big tech companies, and I would agree. And accountable organizations, they want to have sensible rules, because having somebody yesterday, I had an interview yesterday, somebody described, your design features, your privacy policies, the front door. If this is designed in a manner that allows me to exercise my rights, to empower me to know what's happening, then that gives me also an advantage, because it instills trust. And so there is this interest also, not just from a business perspective for convergence, but also as a good corporate citizen, and from keeping my customers with me. Their perspective, they prefer to have, of course, unified laws. It's not about hiding the ball or anything. It's about being able to provide the same standards across. There shouldn't be a difference on how my data is treated here to somewhere else. Normally, so there should, I should have my rights observed, and they should be able to do their business. Both are fundamental rights, and we need to balance them. And so that's my experience there, that there is a great interest. They work very hard to try and work out how to do this in a consistent manner.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Lartease, for joining us. Natascha, Cornelius, thank you so much. And let's hear for him, yeah?